we're going to spend some time reflecting on the significance of Jesus' death. And the first thing to say is that Jesus' death at the end of Mark's Gospel isn't a sudden twist in the narrative. It's not something unexpected. It doesn't jump out at us and take us by surprise. You could say that the whole of Jesus' earthly ministry in Mark's Gospel is lived under the shadow of the cross. You could argue that the scene is set as early as Mark chapter 2, when Jesus enters into conflict with the authorities and they accuse him of being a blasphemer, someone who claims to be equal with God. As Mark's Gospel unfolds, of course, that conflict heightens and heightens and heightens, and the pace of the narrative accelerates, and it's soon quite evident that Jesus' ministry is going to result in his rejection, in his betrayal, in his humiliation, and in his tortuous death. Mark himself gives us three quite interesting insights into why he regards Jesus' death as being significant. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus says these words about himself: "The Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many." Mark chapter 10, Jesus' words are, of course, looking forward to the crucifixion. And he talks about the giving up of his life in terms of ransom. We'll come back to that idea a little bit later. Then at the Last Supper, when Jesus shares this meal with his disciples, he takes the cup with the wine and he says, "This cup is my blood," and it confirms a covenant, a new kind of agreement between God and humanity. It is poured out as a sacrifice for many. There Jesus is focusing our attention on the concept of sacrifice, which again we'll come back to in just a moment. And then when Mark tells the story of the crucifixion itself, he says that Jesus breathed his last, and at that moment the curtain in the Jerusalem temple was torn in two. Now this was particularly significant because that curtain was placed between the heart of the temple, a room that was called the Holy of Holies, a room where God was especially believed to be present. That room represented the presence of God himself. And the only person who was ever permitted to go through that curtain into the Holy of Holies was the high priest, and then he was only permitted to do so once a year. That curtain represented the fact that God is separate from his people. God is holy, and the only way in which humanity and God can be in relationship with one another is if someone exceedingly special, someone who's gone through extensive cleansing rites, offers a sacrifice on behalf of the people. An animal's life must be terminated. Its blood must be shed if humans and God are to be in relationship. Now, Mark says that when Jesus died, that curtain was torn in two. And to my mind, that speaks of one very important concept. It speaks of the concept of access. Now God's presence is accessible. Now there is no barrier between humanity and God. There is no longer any need for extensive cleansing rituals. There's no longer any need for the blood of animals to be spilt. No, God and humanity can be in relationship with one another, not on the basis of any rituals that human beings need to go through, but on the basis of the fact that Jesus has died and his blood has been shed. Now, there are various Christian understandings about the death of Jesus and various ways of explaining why the death of Jesus is so significant. Let's just pick up on two or three of those themes. I mentioned the term ransom earlier. We find that concept in Mark chapter 10. Christians often talk about the cross in terms of ransom. There is a view of the cross which is known as the ransom view. And it goes like this. When Jesus died on the cross, he paid the price so that human beings could be free from slavery to sin and death. So when Jesus shed his blood on the cross, he paid a price. He paid a ransom so that human beings could be set free. Now, this view is one that's explored in C.S. Lewis's classic story, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And you may remember that in that story, the White Witch says of Edmund that this boy is a traitor, and by rights he therefore belongs to her. And at that moment, Aslan, who represents the figure of Christ, has a secret dialogue with the White Witch, and they come to an agreement. They come to an agreement that Aslan will pay the price necessary for Edmund the traitor to go free. Now, at that point in the story, we've no idea precisely what the price was that was agreed. But later in the story, it becomes evident that what was agreed, that Aslan would pay for Edmund to be free with his own life. By giving up his life and dying on the stone table, Aslan would at that moment pay the ransom price. So the ransom view of the death of Jesus is one that is explored and illustrated in that classic story. Then there's another understanding of the cross that's linked with this concept of sacrifice. And as I said earlier, it's a concept that Jesus draws our attention to at the Last Supper. This cup of wine represents my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for many. The Jews understood that they were sinful. They understood that they were guilty, that there wasn't any means for them to be in right relationship with God unless that guilt were dealt with in some way. And they believed that the only way that the guilt of sin could be removed was by sacrificing animals, by the shedding of blood of animals. And so in the Old Testament we read a great deal about the sacrificial system. There's a lot of blood that is spilled in the Old Testament as the Jewish people continually offer animal sacrifices so that their sins might be forgiven and they might be acceptable to God. In the New Testament, Jesus' death on the cross is explained in terms of sacrifice. Jesus is a sacrificial lamb. Jesus is a perfect sacrifice. And because of his blood shed on the cross, it's now possible for sinful humanity to be accepted by God. It's possible for sinful humanity to have their guilt removed and come into right relationship with God. And so no Christian would ever offer an animal sacrifice. There's no need. The sacrificial system has been supplanted because Jesus has died as the perfect sacrifice. Because his blood was shed, there is now perfect access. It's now possible to be in right relationship with God without the necessity of spilling further blood. Let's think of one further understanding of the cross, which is the victory view of the cross. Now, this is a view that isn't expounded particularly explicitly in Mark's Gospel. He doesn't make it particularly clear, but I think that arguably the victory view of the cross is lying behind Mark's story of Jesus' life from beginning to end. The victory view of the cross is this: when Jesus died on the cross, at that moment in time it looked as if Jesus' enemies had won a decisive victory over Jesus. They had him right where they wanted him. They had him nailed, quite literally. But what was really going on in that moment was Jesus was winning a decisive victory over his enemies. Not a decisive victory over the mighty power of Rome, not a victory over state authority. He was winning a victory over sin, death, and Satan. What Jesus was doing when he was dying on the cross was letting evil have its way. He was exposing himself to the full force of evil, and in so doing, he was emptying it of its power. So anyone who believes in Jesus can be free from sin, can be free from death, can be free from Satan, because Jesus won a decisive victory on the cross. So there are three different understandings of the cross. There are others as well. We could talk about the satisfaction model of the cross. We could talk about Jesus' death on the cross as a moral example. But by focusing on those three concepts, the concepts of ransom, sacrifice, and victory, I think we're beginning to understand something of what was probably in Mark's mind when he wrote about the death of Jesus.